The chill of the London townhouse was a familiar ache in Ilara Vance's bones, a damp, persistent cold that had little to do with the October rain weeping against the window panes. It was the cold of absence, of dwindling coal in the scuttle and fading hope in the heart. 3 months had passed since her father's death, and in that time the world she had known, a world of modest comfort, scholarly warmth, and the quiet dignity of a respected, if not wealthy, family, had crumbled into a pile of debt and recrimination. The creditors, like crows, had descended, their polite letters swiftly giving way to thinly veiled threats. From her seat by the window, Ilara watched a carriage rattle over the slick cobblestones, its lamps casting fleeting golden smears across the wet grey street. Inside, a woman in silks and velvets laughed, her head tilted towards a gentleman beside her, a life so impossibly distant now. Ilara's own silk gowns, once her pride, were packed away in a trunk, their value assessed not for the memories they held but for the shillings they might fetch. Her current dress was of sturdy wool, grey as the London sky, its practicality a constant reminder of her new station, or rather, her lack of one. The only offer of salvation had come from Mr. Abernathy, a man whose fortune was as vast as his appetites were crude. He had bought up the majority of her father's debts, and had made his proposition with a leering smile that turned her stomach. Marriage, he would forgive the debt, restore her to a life of material comfort, and in return, she would be his. The thought was a physical violation, a suffocation of the spirit that felt more final than any poverty. She could not, she would not. Her reflection in the rain-streaked glass was a pale, solemn ghost. The dark hair, once styled with care, was now pulled back in a simple, severe knot. Her eyes, the color of twilight, held a resolve that surprised even her. There had to be another way, a path that did not require the selling of her soul. It was this desperate resolve that had led her to the advertisement tucked away in the back pages of the Times. A small, discreet notice, governess required for a young girl in a country estate. Discretion and gentle temperament essential. Apply by letter to the solicitors of Beaumont and Croft. Beaumont. The name was a thunderclap in the quiet room. The Duke of Blackwood. A man spoken of in whispers, a figure of immense wealth and tragic romance. His young, beautiful wife had died a year or two prior. A terrible carriage accident that had shocked the ton. Since then, the Duke had vanished from society, retreating to his ancestral home, a fortress of grief from which no light seemed to escape. He was a recluse, a phantom, a man frozen in sorrow. To offer herself as a servant in such a house was a precipitous fall for a Vance. Her father, a third son of a minor baron, had instilled in her a fierce pride in their lineage, in their name, but pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered now. Her letter had been an exercise in restraint. She had detailed her education, languages, music, history, the arts, all taught by her scholarly father. She had omitted her title, her family name carrying too much weight, too many questions. She was simply Miss Vance, a woman of good breeding and unfortunate circumstances, seeking a respectable position. It felt like a betrayal of everything she had been, yet it was the only way to forge what she might become. To her astonishment, a reply had come, a summons, not to the solicitor's office in the city, but to the ducal estate itself, Blackwood Manor. The name alone conjured images of ancient stone, shadowed forests, and a silence as deep as a tomb. And so she found herself here, a week later, stepping from a hired coach into a world of oppressive grandeur. The journey had taken the better part of a day, the sprawling manicured parks of the home counties giving way to the wilder, more rugged landscape of the north. The air grew crisper, the trees older and more gnarled. Blackwood Manor did not rise gracefully from the landscape. It commanded it, a vast edifice of dark grey stone, its battlements clawed at a sky bruised with the colors of an impending storm. It was more fortress than home, a monument to power and endurance, and as Ilara looked up at its rows of dark, unblinking windows, she felt a profound sense of her own insignificance. She was met at the door, not by a butler, but by a severe-looking housekeeper in black bombazine, her face a roadmap of disciplined severity. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice dry as autumn leaves, "I am Mrs. Gable. His Grace will see you in the library." The interior of the manor was a cavern of shadows and silence. Her footsteps echoed on the black and white marble floor of the great hall. Suits of armor stood like spectral sentinels in the gloom, their metal gleaming dully in the thin light from a high, arched window. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine. Yet the air was heavy, stagnant with a sorrow that seemed to have seeped into the very stone. It was a place meticulously maintained, but utterly devoid of life. The library was the heart of the house's darkness. Bookshelves soared 3 stories high, their leather-bound spines a tapestry of umber and gold. A fire, barely more than a collection of sullenly glowing embers, huddled in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, and there, standing before it, his back to her, was the Duke. He was taller than she had imagined, his shoulders broad beneath a perfectly tailored black coat. He did not turn as she was announced. He simply stood, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, staring down into the dying fire. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Ilara stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was an supplicant, a nobody, and he was making sure she felt it. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the floor. "You are Miss Vance." It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He turned then, and the force of his presence struck her like a physical blow. He was not handsome in the classical sense. His features were too harsh, his jaw too square, his mouth a thin, unyielding line, but it was his eyes that captured her, that held her pinned. They were the color of a winter sea, a piercing, unnerving gray, and they were utterly, terrifyingly empty. There was no warmth in them, no curiosity, only a profound and chilling weariness. This was a man who had looked into the abyss and had found it staring back. "Your letter was concise," he said, his gaze sweeping over her, a clinical assessment that took in her plain dress, her worn boots, her carefully composed expression. She felt like a specimen under glass. It omitted a great deal. "I endeavored to include only what was relevant to the position, Your Grace." A flicker of something, was it surprise, annoyance, crossed his face, so fleeting she thought she might have imagined it. He moved from the fireplace, his steps silent on the thick Persian rug, and took a seat behind a massive mahogany desk. He gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit!" She did, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. The desk was a vast continent of polished wood between them, a barrier he had deliberately erected. He picked up her letter, which lay solitary on the otherwise pristine surface. "You claim an education in the classics, in French and Italian, in pianoforte and watercolor," he stated, his eyes fixed on the page, not on her. "My daughter Lillian is 6 years old. She requires a governess who can shape her mind, certainly, but more than that, she requires structure, consistency, a presence that is neither overly sentimental nor prone to flights of fancy." His voice was a monotone, each word delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He was not interviewing her, he was dictating terms. "I am not a sentimental woman, Your Grace," Ilara said, her own voice steadier than she felt. For the first time he looked at her again, a long, searching look that seemed to peel back the layers of her composure. "No," he said slowly, as if confirming a private diagnosis. "I do not believe you are." He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. "The position comes with rooms in the East Wing, a generous salary, and 1 day of rest per week. Your duties will be confined to the nursery, the schoolroom, and the gardens. You will take your meals there with my daughter. You will not be expected to join me for dinner, nor will you be required to entertain guests, as there will be none." The finality of his words was absolute. He was drawing the lines of her confinement, making it clear that she was to be a ghost in his house, a functional component, nothing more. She was to care for his child, but she was not to touch his life. "I understand," she murmured. "I must be clear, Miss Vance," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a harsh, raw thing. "I am not looking for a companion for my daughter. I am not looking for a woman to bring light and laughter back into these halls. I am hiring a custodian for her education and her schedule. Her emotional well-being is to be managed with quiet efficiency. There will be no coddling, no indulgence in feminine hysterics. Blackwood is a place of order and silence. Do you believe you can adhere to such a regimen?" The insult was plain, the disdain for her gender a bitter pill, but beneath the cold cruelty of his words, Ilara heard something else, a desperate, terrified plea. "Do not make me feel, do not bring your life into the tomb I have built." He was a man not just in mourning, but in hiding from the very concept of emotion. And in his brokenness, she saw her own path forward. She could be the silence he demanded. She could be the order he craved. For her, this house was not a tomb, but a sanctuary from Mr. Abernathy, from the ruin of her past. She could endure the cold. She had been living in it for months. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, meeting his empty gaze without flinching. "I can." He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching once more. She felt as though he were weighing her soul. Finally, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well," he said, his tone one of finality. He stood, signaling the end of the interview. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. You will begin tomorrow." He did not offer his hand. He did not wish her well. He simply turned his back on her and returned to his vigil at the fireplace, a solitary king in a kingdom of shadows. As Mrs. Gable led her from the room, Ilara risked one last glance back. He had not moved. He was a statue of grief, and she was now a prisoner in his mausoleum, but a prisoner with a purpose. A prisoner who was, for the first time in a long time, safe. And for now, that was enough. The east wing was a world away from the oppressive grandeur of the main house. The corridors were narrower, the ceilings lower, but the windows faced south, and even on this grey afternoon, a softer, more forgiving light filtered through. Her rooms consisted of a small but comfortable sitting room and an adjoining bedroom, both furnished with well-made, if slightly faded, pieces. A fire had been lit in the hearth, its cheerful crackle a startling contrast to the moribund embers in the Duke's library. It was a pocket of warmth in the vast, cold house. His Grace had these rooms prepared, Mrs. Gable stated, her hands clasped at her waist. "The nursery and schoolroom are at the end of this hall. Lady Lillian is with her nursemaid. You will be introduced in the morning." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Ilara said, moving to the window. It overlooked a vast, sprawling expanse of what must have once been gardens. Now they were a chaotic tangle of weeds and overgrown rose bushes, their thorny arms reaching out like desperate supplicants. A stone wall, green with moss, enclosed it, and beyond that, a dark line of ancient yew trees stood like sentinels. The neglect was profound, a mirror to the decay within the house itself. "The late Duchess, she was very fond of the gardens," Mrs. Gable offered, her voice softening for the first time. The remark hung in the air, an epitaph for a time of beauty and life that was now gone. "They have a good structure," Ilara observed quietly. "They could be beautiful again." Mrs. Gable looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in her shrewd eyes. "Perhaps," she said, and then, with a return to her customary briskness, "Your trunk will be brought up. Dinner will be served in your sitting room at 7. She curtsied and departed, leaving Ilara alone with the crackling fire and the view of the ruined garden. Ilara sank into the armchair by the hearth, the warmth seeping into her chilled limbs. The arrangement was made. She had a place, a purpose. She had accepted the terms of a loveless, silent world, governed by a man whose heart was as shuttered and dark as his house. She would be Miss Vance, the governess, a quiet, efficient presence in the life of a little girl she had yet to meet. She would endure the Duke's coldness, his deliberate distance. She would walk the corridors of his silent house and tend to the small corner of it that was now hers. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the glass, and the wind howled around the stone eaves. But here in her small room, with the fire dancing and a future, however constrained, stretching before her, Ilara felt not fear, but a strange and quiet sense of peace. She had stepped into the Duke of Blackwood's tomb, and in its profound silence, she hoped she might finally find a place to heal her own shattered world. The days at Blackwood Manor settled into a rhythm dictated by bells and silence, a bell for rising, a bell for lessons, a bell for meals in the nursery, and in between, the pervasive, heavy silence of the house. Ilara saw the Duke only fleetingly, a glimpse of his tall figure disappearing down a long corridor, the sound of his study door closing with grim finality, his imposing presence at the far end of the long dining table on the rare occasions she was required to dine with the family, though "with" was a generous term. Those dinners were the greatest trial. She and her young charge, Lillian, would sit at one end of the vast candle-lit table, while the Duke sat at the other, a chasm of polished mahogany and unspoken grief between them. He never spoke, save for a curt nod of acknowledgement when they entered. He ate with a mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, lost in a world she could not begin to imagine. He was a ghost at his own feast, and his funereal presence leached the flavor from the food and the warmth from the air. Lillian, her charge, was a miniature reflection of her father, a slip of a girl with his dark hair and a pale, serious face. But her eyes were different. They were a deep, soulful blue, and they were filled not with the emptiness of her father's, but with a watchful, waiting anxiety. She was a quiet child, unnaturally so. She spoke in whispers, moved with a tentative grace, and seemed perpetually braced for a reprimand that never came. Her world was one of rigid order, her days prescribed by the nursemaid's strict schedule, her emotional landscape a barren wasteland. Ilara's first task was not to teach the child her letters, but to teach her she was a child. She began not in the schoolroom, with its stiff-backed chairs and dusty globe, but in the nursery. She read stories, her voice soft and even, filling the quiet room with tales of brave knights and mischievous fairies. At first Lillian listened with a detached stillness, her hands folded primly in her lap, but slowly, day by day, she began to lean closer, a small, almost imperceptible shift. Ilara observed everything. She saw the way Lily flinched at loud noises, the way she would hoard small, pretty things, a smooth stone, a fallen feather, a scrap of silk, hiding them in a small box, as if they were treasures in a dragon's hoard. She saw the way the child's gaze would drift to the windows that overlooked the tangled, overgrown gardens, a flicker of longing in her sad blue eyes. The Duke remained a distant, unknowable continent. She learned of him through observation, piecing together a portrait from fragments. He was a man of relentless routine. He rose before dawn, rode out on a black stallion regardless of the weather, and spent his days locked in his library, presumably managing the vast affairs of his estate. He was never cruel, merely absent. His instructions were delivered via Mrs. Gable. His presence felt only as a weight, a pressure in the atmosphere of the house. Yet there were cracks in the icy facade. One afternoon, as Ilara was demonstrating a simple waltz to a hesitant Lillian in the nursery, the music from the small pianoforte lilting and gentle, she glanced up to see him standing in the doorway. He was utterly still, his face half hidden in shadow, and for a single unguarded moment she saw not the cold Duke, but a man ravaged by a pain so profound it was a physical deformity. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, and in their depths a maelstrom of emotions swirled, love, grief, and a terrible, aching regret. The moment he saw her looking, the mask slammed back into place. He gave a curt nod and was gone, leaving only the echo of his sorrow in the air. Another time, Lillian, who had been struggling with a watercolor of a robin, looked up at Ilara and asked in a small, hesitant voice, "Did Mama paint?" The question hung in the air, a fragile, dangerous thing. Ilara, who knew nothing of the late Duchess, chose her words with care. "I am not sure, my dear, but you have a wonderful talent for it. See the way you have captured the red of its breast." Later that day, Ilara found the courage to ask Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper was overseeing the polishing of silver, her movements brisk and efficient. "The late Duchess?" Mrs. Gable paused, her polishing cloth still. "Her Grace was an artist. Her studio was in the West Wing." She said it with a finality that discouraged further questions. The West Wing. Ilara had noticed it on her first day. The doors to that entire section of the house were kept closed. The servants never went there, and a fine layer of dust coated the floor near the threshold, a silent testament to its abandonment. It was a place of memory, a shrine to the woman whose ghost still ruled the master of the house. It was a part of the Duke's heart that was locked and barred, just like the rooms themselves. Life at Blackwood was a cold truce, an agreement to coexist without connection. Ilara upheld her end of the bargain. She was efficient, quiet, and kept to her designated spaces. She managed Lillian's emotional needs with a gentle, steady hand, offering comfort without sentimentality, encouragement without effusive praise. She was precisely the automaton the Duke had requested, but she was a woman, not a machine. And in the long, quiet evenings, after Lillian was asleep, she would sit by her fire and feel the profound loneliness of the house seep into her. She would read, or mend her clothes, or simply stare into the flames, her thoughts her only company. She thought of her father, of the warm, cluttered library of her childhood home, a place of lively debate and easy affection. The contrast with Blackwood, so vast and wealthy, and yet so emotionally impoverished, was a constant dull ache. She often found her gaze drawn to the ruined gardens. They called to her a canvas of neglect that mirrored the state of the family she now served. The chaos of the weeds, the skeletal remains of untended rose bushes, the choked and overgrown paths. It was a portrait of a heart left to ruin, and a small defiant thought began to take root in her mind. A thought that was not part of her duties, not part of the cold bargain she had struck. It was an idea that felt like a risk, a subtle rebellion against the suffocating stasis of Blackwood. She could not bring laughter back into these halls as the Duke had forbidden it. She could not mend his broken heart. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could bring one small patch of beauty back to his world. Perhaps she could tend a garden. It was a quiet, harmless thing, an act of creation in a house dedicated to the preservation of loss. She did not know why it felt so important, only that the image of it, of coaxing life from the dead earth, was a flicker of light in the pervasive gloom. It was an initiative she felt compelled to take, a silent challenge to the reign of sorrow that held Blackwood in its grip. The decision, once made, settled in Ilara's mind with a quiet certainty. It was a small, private rebellion. She would not ask the Duke for permission. To do so would be to invite a refusal, to draw attention to an act that needed to begin in shadow. She approached Mrs. Gable instead, framing her request with careful practicality. "The schoolroom can be rather close in the afternoons," she explained one morning as the housekeeper did her rounds. "I thought some practical botany lessons might benefit Lady Lillian. There is a small walled section behind the east wing, near the old potting sheds. If it is not in use, perhaps we might be permitted to clear a small patch for a teaching garden." Mrs. Gable's shrewd eyes assessed her. The housekeeper missed little. She surely understood that this was more than a simple educational exercise. But she had also witnessed the subtle, positive changes in Lillian under Ilara's care. The child whispered less, smiled more. Her cheeks had a touch more color. "The old kitchen garden," Mrs. Gable said, her tone neutral. "It has not been touched in years. The head gardener, Mr. Croft, concerns himself only with the main lawns and the drive. He will not object." She paused, then added, "You will find old tools in the shed. See that they are cleaned and put away." It was not a yes, but it was not a no. It was permission granted through omission, the preferred method of communication at Blackwood. And so it began. That afternoon, Ilara led a curious Lillian to the forgotten corner of the estate. The gate, its ironwork choked with ivy, groaned in protest as she pushed it open. Inside, it was a scene of beautiful decay. A stone path was barely visible beneath a carpet of moss and weeds. The skeletons of old cold frames sagged against a crumbling brick wall, where, miraculously, a single determined climbing rose still clung. Its leaves a dark, glossy green. It was a secret, forgotten world. "What is this place?" Lillian whispered, her eyes wide. "This," Ilara said, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity, "is going to be our garden." Their first task was clearing. It was hard, physical work. Ilara, in a sturdy apron over her dress, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, taught Lillian how to distinguish weeds from dormant perennials, how to gently clear the earth around the tough woody crowns of lavender and thyme that had somehow survived the neglect. Her own hands, accustomed to needlepoint and the keys of a pianoforte, quickly became calloused and sore. But the ache was a satisfying one. It was the ache of effort, of creation. Lillian, at first hesitant to soil her pristine dresses, was soon caught up in the magic of it. She discovered the joy of pulling up a long, stubborn taproot, the thrill of uncovering a dormant bulb, a tiny promise of future life. Her quietness was replaced by a stream of questions, her whispers by exclamations of discovery. For the first time, in this small, forgotten patch of earth, she was simply a child. They worked every afternoon that the weather allowed. Ilara found a rhythm in the physical labor, the repetitive motion of the hoe, the scent of damp earth, the satisfaction of seeing a small patch of dark, rich soil emerge from the chaos. It was a balm to her soul. It was a task with a clear, tangible result, a stark contrast to the delicate, uncertain work of mending a child's fractured spirit. She was aware, always, that they might be observed. The Duke's study window had a clear, if distant, view of this part of the grounds. Sometimes she would feel a prickling on the back of her neck, a sense of being watched, and would glance up towards the great house. More than once she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows of the library window, a tall, dark silhouette, motionless and unreadable. She never acknowledged it. She simply turned back to her work, her hands deep in the soil. She was Miss Vance, the governess, conducting a lesson in botany. That was all. One afternoon, as they were clearing the last of the weeds from a bed near the wall, Lillian let out a small cry of delight. "Miss Vance, look!" Buried beneath a thick mat of ivy were small stone markers, nearly swallowed by the earth. Ilara knelt and carefully cleared the dirt away. They were herb markers, each one carved with a name: rosemary for remembrance, lavender for serenity, sage for wisdom. "My lady mother," Lillian breathed, her small hand tracing the word serenity. Mrs. Gable said she loved the gardens. It was the first time Lillian had mentioned her mother with anything other than a prompted, fearful query. Here, in this place they were bringing back to life, the ghost of the late Duchess seemed not a source of sorrow, but a gentle, benevolent presence. "I think she would be very happy to see us taking care of it," Ilara said softly. The small act of defiance, of bringing life to a place long dead, began to have subtle ripple effects within the house. Lillian, energized by her afternoons outdoors, had a healthier appetite. Her sleep was deeper. Her lessons in the schoolroom were marked by a new focus and curiosity. She began to hum as she worked, small, tuneless melodies that were, in the oppressive silence of Blackwood, as loud and joyful as a church organ. Ilara knew the Duke must notice these changes, but he said nothing. His silence was a constant, a vast ocean against which she was a tiny, hopeful shore. He remained distant, enclosed in his grief. The dinners were as silent as ever, his presence as remote. But his observation of her continued. She felt it not as a threat but as a question. He was watching, waiting. He had hired her to be an automaton, to maintain the sterile order of his world. Instead, she was cultivating a garden, and in doing so, was cultivating his daughter. She was challenging the status quo not with words or demands, but with the simple, irrefutable evidence of a blooming flower and a child's happy hum. The greatest challenge came not from the Duke, however, but from a new arrival. One crisp November morning, a handsome carriage swept up the drive, and from it emerged a woman swathed in expensive furs, her beauty as sharp and cold as the winter air. Mrs. Gable, her face grim, announced the visitor to Ilara in the schoolroom. Lady Beatrice Croft, his Grace's cousin by his late marriage. She has come for an extended visit. Lady Beatrice was the late Duchess's cousin, a woman who had, according to society pages Ilara vaguely recalled, been a constant companion to the tragic couple. She swept into the house as if she were its mistress, her voice loud and imperious, a shocking disruption to the carefully maintained silence. Her assessment of Ilara was swift and dismissive. "And you are the governess," she said, her eyes the color of chips of ice, raking over Ilara's simple dress. The words were a clear demarcation of status, a reminder of Ilara's place. Ilara met her gaze calmly. "Miss Vance, it is a pleasure to meet you, Lady Beatrice." Lady Beatrice's arrival heralded a shift in the delicate ecosystem of Blackwood. She inserted herself into every aspect of the household, issuing orders to the staff, rearranging furniture, and, most disturbingly, attempting to impose her will on Lillian. She treated the child like a doll to be dressed up and shown off, criticizing her quietness and attempting to override Ilara's carefully structured routine with frivolous, unsuitable diversions. The garden became Ilara and Lillian's sanctuary, a place to escape Lady Beatrice's oppressive presence. But even there, they were not safe. "Good heavens, what is this?" Lady Beatrice exclaimed one afternoon, appearing at the gate to their small, reclaimed world. She looked at their dirt-smudged aprons and Lillian's rosy cheeks with open distaste. "Alistair, do you see this? She has your daughter digging in the dirt like a common farmhand." Ilara turned. The Duke was standing behind Lady Beatrice, his expression, as always, unreadable. He had been walking the grounds, a rare occurrence, and his cousin had clearly intercepted him. "It is a lesson in botany, Lady Beatrice," Ilara said, her voice even, "and Lillian finds great joy in it." Joy! She should be learning deportment, practicing her French verbs, not this. She waved a dismissive gloved hand at their carefully tended beds. "Isabel would be horrified." At the mention of his late wife's name, a muscle tightened in the Duke's jaw. His gaze moved from Lady Beatrice's indignant face to the small, hopeful garden, and then to his daughter, who had instinctively moved to stand. Closer to Ilara, he looked at the neat rows they had planted, the small shoots of winter greens pushing through the soil, the climbing rows they had carefully pruned and tied back against the wall. He looked at his daughter's hands, smudged with honest earth, and at her eyes, which were not fearful, but bright and alive. He did not speak for a long time. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Lady Beatrice waited with a triumphant smirk, certain he would side with her, with the memory of her cousin, with the old ways of grief and propriety. Then the Duke looked directly at Ilara. His winter-sea eyes were not empty this time. They held a flicker of something she could not name. Respect, gratitude. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but she had seen it. It was the first glimmer. "Lillian seems—" "Well," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He then turned his gaze to his cousin. "The governess has her duties well in hand, Beatrice. Leave them to their lessons." He turned and walked back towards the house without another word. Lady Beatrice was left staring after him, her mouth agape, her triumphant expression curdling into one of disbelief and fury. Ilara's heart was hammering against her ribs. It was not a declaration of war, but it was a line drawn in the soil. He had defended her. He had chosen the evidence of his own eyes over the dictates of the past. In that one brief exchange, the cold truce of Blackwood had been fractured, and a new, fragile and terrifying possibility had begun to take root. He had seen the life she was nurturing, and he had not crushed it. The first frost of winter arrived, silvering the overgrown lawns of Blackwood and glazing the dark, upturned soil of Ilara and Lillian's small garden. The hard work of autumn was done. Dormant roots were settled, bulbs were buried, and a protective layer of straw covered the most delicate plants. The garden slept, waiting for spring, a quiet promise of future life. Inside the house, however, a different kind of frost had settled. Lady Beatrice, stung by the Duke's public dismissal of her concerns, had shifted her tactics. Open confrontation had failed, so she resorted to a campaign of subtle undermining. a series of pinpricks designed to remind Ilara of her inferior position. She would interrupt lessons with frivolous demands, countermand Ilara's instructions to Lillian with a sickly sweet, "Oh, but darling, your dear mama would have wanted you to," and make pointed comments at dinner about the challenges of finding suitable staff. Ilara bore it all with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate Lady Beatrice even more. She refused to be drawn into a battle of wills. Her focus remained on Lillian, who was becoming increasingly withdrawn and anxious again under her great-aunt's suffocating influence. The garden, now too cold for work, was no longer a refuge, and the oppressive atmosphere of the house, which had briefly lightened, became heavier than ever. The Duke retreated further into himself. He was a thundercloud on the horizon of their daily lives. A brooding presence felt more than seen. He seemed to be caught in a tug-of-war between the cloying, manipulative grief peddled by Lady Beatrice and the quiet, steady life Ilara was trying to build for his daughter. Ilara could feel his conflict in the tension that radiated from him during their silent dinners, in the way his gaze would sometimes settle on her with a look of intense, frustrated contemplation. The glimmer of warmth she had seen in the garden felt like a distant memory, a trick of the light. She began to doubt herself, to wonder if her small rebellion had been a mistake. Perhaps the Duke was right, perhaps Blackwood was meant to be a tomb, and her attempts to plant flowers in it were a fool's errand. The shared challenge that would force them into an uneasy alliance came, as such things often do, not with a bang, but with a cough, a small, dry cough from Lillian in the middle of the night. Ilara, a light sleeper, heard it through the adjoining wall and went to check on her. The child was feverish, her skin hot and dry, her breathing shallow. By morning the fever had worsened. Dr. Hemlock was sent for, a kindly, elderly man who had served the family for decades. His diagnosis was grim, a severe inflammation of the lungs. The coming days would be critical. A quarantine was established. The East Wing became an infirmary. Ilara, refusing to leave Lillian's side, became her full-time nurse. Mrs. Gable provided support, bringing broth and clean linens, her usual severity replaced by a quiet, anxious competence. Lady Beatrice was horrified. "You cannot possibly stay in there with her," she insisted to the Duke in the great hall, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You'll catch the contagion. We must hire a proper nurse. That governess is hardly qualified." Ilara, on her way to fetch more cool water, paused just out of sight. She heard the Duke's reply, his voice low and serrated. "Miss Vance will stay. She has not left my daughter's side. She has shown more care in 2 days than you have in 2 months. Now, if you are so concerned about contagion, Beatrice, I suggest you remain in your rooms." The dismissal was absolute, brutal in its finality. It was a declaration of trust, an acknowledgement of Ilara's devotion that resonated more deeply than any compliment. He was not just defending her methods now, he was defending her. The days that followed blurred into a sleepless, anxious haze. Ilara sat by Lillian's bedside, bathing her forehead, coaxing spoonfuls of water between her cracked lips, reading to her in a low, soothing murmur, even when the child was delirious. The Duke was a constant, silent presence. He would appear in the doorway at all hours, his face etched with a pain and fear that stripped away his ducal arrogance, leaving only a terrified father. He never entered the room fully, as if a line had been drawn that he could not cross. But he would stand there for hours, simply watching, his presence a strange, silent comfort. One night, the fever peaked. Lillian's breathing became ragged, a terrible, rasping sound that tore at Ilara's heart. Dr. Hemlock had done all he could. All that was left was to wait. Exhausted and heartsick, Ilara slumped in the chair beside the bed, her head bowed. She must have drifted off, for she was startled by a hand on her shoulder. It was the Duke. He had finally crossed the threshold. In his other hand, he held a cup of tea. "You should drink this," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "And then you should rest. I will watch over her." Ilara looked up at him, her vision blurry with fatigue. The lamplight softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing the deep shadows of worry under his eyes. "I cannot leave her," she whispered. "You will be of no use to her if you collapse," he stated, not unkindly. He placed the tea in her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a startling current of warmth in the cold, sick room. "There is a cot in the dressing room. An hour. I will wake you if there is any change." It was an order, but it was also an act of care. For the first time he was seeing her not as an employee, but as a person, an ally in this desperate fight. Too weary to argue, she acquiesced. As she left the room, she saw him take her place in the chair by the bed, his large hand gently stroking his daughter's feverish brow. She slept for more than an hour, and awoke with a start. The silence from the next room a terrifying weight. She rushed back to Lillian's bedside. The Duke was still there, his head in his hands. Lillian was breathing, quietly, evenly. The rasp was gone. Ilara reached out and touched the child's forehead. It was cool, damp with sweat, but cool. The fever had broken, a wave of relief so profound it left her weak, washed over Ilara. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back streamed down her face. She sank to her knees by the bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She felt a hand on her back, a gentle, steadying pressure. "She will be well," the Duke said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you." They remained like that for a long time, two strangers bound by a shared crisis and a profound, exhausted relief, their vigil finally over. In the grey light of dawn filtering through the window, the foundations of their relationship had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just the governess. They were two people who had fought together for the life of a child they both loved. Later that day, with Lillian sleeping peacefully, the Duke found Ilara in her sitting room. She was staring into the fire, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The fatigue of the past week settled deep in her bones. "Beatrice is leaving," he announced without preamble. Ilara simply nodded. It seemed inevitable. He came to stand by the mantelpiece, much as he had on that first day in the library. But the vast empty space was gone. Now the small room felt intimate, charged with a new, uncertain energy. "She said something before she left," he continued, his voice low. "She said I was allowing you to erase Isabel's memory, that I was letting you replace her." He gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "The irony is, she has no idea what Isabel's memory truly is." He looked at Ilara then, and his eyes were not empty. They were filled with a world of pain and a dawning clarity. "Isabel, my wife, she did not love this house. She did not love the country," he said, the words sounding rusty, as if they had not been spoken in years. "She despised the quiet. She hated the gardens. She thought them provincial." This was a revelation, a small but significant crack in the monolithic story of the perfect, tragic Duchess. Lady Beatrice had built a shrine to a woman who, it seemed, had never wanted to be there. "She would have hated what you are doing with that patch of earth," he went on, a strange, wondering look on his face. "She would have called it common. And yet, it is the first time I have seen Lillian truly happy." He paused, his gaze intense. "It is the first time in years I have felt anything other than the cold." He was giving her a piece of the truth, a small, precious shard of his story. It was not a confession, not yet, but it was a beginning. He was trusting her, not just with his daughter, but with a glimpse of his own wounded heart. The crisis had forced them into a vulnerable alliance, and in that shared vulnerability, the walls he had so carefully constructed had begun finally to crumble. The days following Lillian's recovery were marked by a profound and unsettling shift in the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor. The oppressive weight of grief had not vanished, but it had lessened, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of peace. With Lady Beatrice gone, the house seemed to breathe again. The silence was no longer heavy and funereal, but calm and restorative. Lillian's recuperation was swift. The resilience of childhood, bolstered by Ilara's constant, gentle care, brought the color back to her cheeks and the light to her eyes. She was more openly affectionate than ever before, frequently taking Ilara's hand or leaning against her as they read, small gestures of trust and love that warmed Ilara's heart. The greatest change, however, was in the Duke. The man who had been a distant, brooding phantom now seemed present. He began to take his evening meal with them in the nursery dining room, a small, informal space adjacent to the schoolroom. The first time he appeared, Mrs. Gable had looked as though the sky might fall. But Ilara had simply set another place at the small table. He sat in the too-small chair, his long legs cramped, and for the first time he spoke during the meal. He asked Lillian about her lessons. He asked Ilara about the books they were reading. The conversation was stilted, halting, the efforts of a man relearning a long-forgotten language. But it was a start. He had shared a piece of his past, a crack in the myth of his perfect, lamented wife. That small confidence had created a new intimacy between them, an unspoken understanding that hummed in the air whenever they were near. Ilara found herself observing him with a new curiosity, her earlier impressions giving way to a more complex, compassionate understanding. She saw not just the cold, grieving Duke, but Alistair, a man who had been deeply wounded, who had locked his heart away not just from sorrow, but from a truth too painful to acknowledge. A week after Lillian was deemed fully recovered, a fierce winter storm descended upon Blackwood. For 2 days, wind and snow raged, cutting the manor off from the rest of the world. They were marooned, an island of stone and warmth in a sea of white. The storm seemed to heighten the emotional intensity within the house, forcing them into even closer proximity. On the second night of the storm, after Lillian was asleep, Ilara found she could not settle. The howling of the wind was a mournful symphony that echoed the disquiet in her own soul. She wrapped herself in a thick shawl and made her way down to the library, seeking the comfort of books. She did not expect to find him there. He was standing by the great window, staring out at the swirling chaos of the blizzard, a glass of brandy in his hand. The only light came from the fire, which roared in the hearth, casting flickering, dancing shadows across the room. He turned as she entered, and his expression was not cold or distant. It was raw, unguarded. The storm outside seemed to be mirrored in his eyes. "I could not sleep," she said softly, hesitating in the doorway. "Nor I," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the chair opposite his own by the fire. "Please join me." She did, sinking into the soft leather, holding her hands out to the comforting warmth of the flames. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scream of the wind. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared solitude, a quiet companionship. "The night Isabel died," he said suddenly, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the storm. "It was a night like this, not snow, but rain, a terrible driving rain." Ilara's heart constricted. She said nothing, knowing that this was a threshold. He was choosing to let her in, to show her the locked room at the center of his heart. "We had been at a ball," he continued, his eyes fixed on the fire, his voice a flat, dead monotone, as if he were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "We argued. We were always arguing. About London, about her spending, about everything. She wanted to leave that night, to return to the city. I refused. The roads were treacherous. She called me a coward, a jailer. She said she would rather die than spend another day in this provincial tomb." He took a long swallow of his brandy. The firelight glinted on the rim of the glass, on the taut line of his jaw. "She ordered the carriage herself. I begged her not to go. She laughed at me. She said she was going to meet someone who appreciated her, who wasn't afraid of life." His voice broke on the last word, a single sharp crack in his composure. "I knew who she meant. I had known for months. I just refused to see it." The truth, when it came, was a quiet, devastating blow, not a tragic accident befalling a beloved wife, but the culmination of a miserable, deceitful marriage. "The carriage went off the road at Blackwood Bridge. They said the horses were spooked by a falling branch. She was killed instantly." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his powerful frame. "The world mourned the Duchess of Blackwood, the beautiful, vibrant woman taken too soon. They pitied me, the heartbroken husband left with a motherless child, and I let them. I built a fortress of that lie, and I locked myself inside it." He turned to look at her then, and his face was a mask of self-loathing. "My grief was real. But it was not for the woman society thought they knew. I grieved for my own foolishness, for the shame of being so thoroughly deceived. I grieved for Lillian, who would grow up with the ghost of a saint for a mother, a woman who had barely tolerated her existence. And I locked away her wing of the house not as a shrine, but because I could not bear to look at the evidence of my own failure. Every beautiful thing in those rooms was a lie I had paid for." The full revelation settled over Ilara, heavy and profound. His coldness, his silence, his harsh terms of her employment, it all made a terrible kind of sense. He was not a man frozen in sorrow for a lost love. He was a man entombed by betrayal and shame. He had hired her to be an automaton because he had come to believe that all emotion, all warmth, was a precursor to deception and pain. "You have been living in a prison of your own making," she whispered, her voice filled with a compassion that surprised her. "Yes," he said, the word a raw exhalation of breath, "and I did not realize it until I saw you in the garden with Lillian." He set his glass down, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense, searching. "You are not sentimental. You do not deal in hysterics or false flattery. You are real. You brought life back to that dead patch of earth, and you did it quietly, diligently, without asking for praise. You are teaching my daughter to be strong and kind, not merely ornamental. You saved her life, and in doing so you have shown me the key to my own prison." The confession hung between them, raw and powerful. He had stripped himself bare, revealing the ugly, painful truth he had hidden from the world for years. He had trusted her with his deepest shame, his most profound wound. Ilara felt her own carefully constructed walls begin to dissolve. The professional distance she had maintained, the quiet resignation she had cultivated, it was no match for the raw humanity of the man before her. She had come to Blackwood seeking sanctuary, a place to endure. She had not expected to find a kindred spirit in its broken, solitary master. She had not expected to feel this deep, aching pull of connection. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment, before she gently placed it on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath the fine wool of his coat. "No one should have to carry such a burden alone, Alistair," she said, the use of his given name feeling both shockingly intimate and perfectly natural. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. His eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, were filled with a dawning wonder, as if he were seeing her, seeing himself for the first time. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside the library, in the warm, flickering firelight, the storm had finally broken. The secrets were out, the truth, however painful, was free, and in its wake, something new and fragile and full of terrifying hope was beginning to grow. The aftermath of the storm was a world transformed. Blackwood Manor awoke to a landscape of profound silence, blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of snow. The sun, a rare winter visitor, emerged from behind the clouds, setting the white world ablaze with a dazzling crystalline light. It was as if the confession in the library had cleansed not just the air between them, but the world itself. Alistair was a changed man. The revelation of his past, the lancing of that festering wound, had freed him. The brooding, remote Duke was gone, replaced by a man who was quieter, more thoughtful, but infinitely more present. The harsh lines around his mouth and eyes seemed to soften. He smiled. Small, tentative smiles at first, but genuine nonetheless. He began to join Ilara and Lillian, not just for dinner, but for walks in the snow-covered grounds, for story time by the nursery fire. He sought out Ilara's company, her conversation. They would talk for hours in the evenings, after Lillian was asleep. He asked about her life before Blackwood, about her scholarly father, about her love of books and music. He listened with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world, and she, in turn, began to see the man behind the title, intelligent, with a dry, unexpected wit and a deep, buried well of kindness. The dynamic between them was no longer that of employer and employee. They were two equals, two friends, navigating the uncharted territory of their shared space. The house itself seemed to change with its master. Fires were lit in the grand fireplaces of the public rooms, which had been cold and unused for years. Mrs. Gable began humming as she went about her duties. Laughter, Lillian's at first, then Alistair's deep, rumbling response, and finally Ilara's own, clear and bright, began to echo in the once silent halls. One afternoon he came to the schoolroom. Lillian was at the pianoforte picking out a simple tune Ilara had taught her. Alistair stood in the doorway listening, a soft, proud look on his face. When the tune was finished, he crossed the room and sat down on the bench beside his daughter. "Your mother," he said, his voice gentle, "the one you have in your heart, would have loved that." It was the first time he had spoken of Isabel without a shadow of bitterness, reframing her memory for Lillian into something a child could hold without being poisoned by the truth. He then looked at Ilara, his grey eyes warm. "And your other mother," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear, "has taught you beautifully." The implication, the quiet inclusion of her into their family, sent a flush of heat through her cheeks. The turning point, the moment when the unspoken current between them finally broke the surface, came a week later. The snow had begun to melt, and the world was a dripping, glistening landscape of green and white. Alistair asked her to walk with him. He led her not to the main paths, but towards the west wing. He stopped before the great dust-sheathed doors and produced a heavy iron key. "I think it is time," he said, his voice quiet, "to let the light in." He unlocked the doors. The air that met them was stale, thick with the scent of dust and faded perfume. He pushed open the heavy curtains, and afternoon sunlight streamed into the room, illuminating a scene frozen in time. It was a suite of rooms, exquisitely furnished in the French style, all pale silks, gilded furniture, and delicate porcelain. It was beautiful, but it was also cold, impersonal, like a room in a museum. It was the room of a woman who had been playing a part. He led her through the sitting room, past a dressing room, with a silver-backed brush left on the vanity, and into a vast bedroom. Dominating one wall was a portrait. It was the late Duchess, Isabel. She was stunningly beautiful, with blonde hair, laughing blue eyes, and a perfect pouting mouth. But looking at the portrait now, knowing the truth, Ilara could see the coldness in the eyes, the acquisitive gleam, the calculation behind the smile. It was the face of a stranger. Alistair stood before it for a long moment, his expression calm, contemplative. "This is not who she was," he said finally. "And this is not who I am anymore." He turned to Ilara, his face serious. "I am having it taken down, all of it. I am going to have the rooms redecorated. I want to make them ours." The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Ours. He stepped closer, closing the small space that separated them. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was electric, a current of warmth and tenderness that seemed to melt the last of her reserve. "Ilara," he said, her name a soft prayer on his lips, "when you came here, I was a dead man, living in a tomb of my own making. You walked into my darkness, and you did not try to banish it with false light. You simply planted a seed. You tended it. You waited for it to grow. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in their depths a reflection of her own burgeoning feelings, a love that had grown quietly, unexpectedly, in the most fallow of ground. "I have been a fool," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "a blind, stubborn fool. I thought I needed silence and order. I thought I needed to protect myself from feeling anything ever again. But what I need, is you." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound, grateful tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of sorrow and redemption, of long overdue truth and the promise of a new beginning. It was a homecoming. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin. The sunlight streamed around them, filled with dancing dust motes, illuminating the end of one life and the start of another. The ghosts of Blackwood had been exorcised, the locked wing was open, the turning point had been reached, and on the other side of it lay a future she had never dared to imagine. The weeks that followed were a revelation. It was as if spring had arrived not just in the world outside, but within the walls of Blackwood and in the landscape of Ilara's heart. The love that had been a fragile, unspoken thing between her and Alistair was now a certainty, a quiet, powerful force that reordered their world. The portrait of Isabel was taken down, and with its removal, the last of the chilling artifice fell away from the house. The west wing was thrown open, its rooms aired out, the furniture draped in canvas in preparation for its transformation. It was no longer a forbidden shrine to a lie, but simply a part of the house, a space filled with the promise of a new life. Alistair, unburdened by the weight of his secrets, was a man reborn. He was engaged, present, his mind no longer lost in the shadows of the past. He took an active interest in the estate, in his tenants, in the world beyond his library door. But his greatest focus, his constant center, was Ilara and Lillian. He was a devoted father, patient and loving, making up for lost time with a gentle determination that brought tears to Ilara's eyes, and he was a tender, attentive suitor. He and Ilara spent every possible moment together. Their days were filled with shared duties and simple pleasures, reviewing estate plans, choosing new wallpapers for the West Wing, reading side by side in the library, their comfortable silence a testament to their deep connection. He learned the rhythm of her days, the small things that brought her joy, the quiet strength that was the bedrock of her character. He delighted in surprising her. A rare first edition of a book she had mentioned left on her pillow, a ride out to a beautiful hidden waterfall on the estate he had not visited in years. He showed her the man he was, the man he had been before the bitterness and betrayal had encased him in ice, and Ilara, in turn, allowed herself to blossom in the warmth of his affection. The quiet, resilient governess who had arrived at Blackwood seeking only survival found herself falling deeply, irrevocably in love. She had found not just a sanctuary, but a home. Her role as governess had become a loving formality. She was already Lillian's mother in every way that mattered. She was already Alistair's partner, his confidant, his most trusted advisor. But the final formal declaration had not yet been made. There was a propriety to it, a rightness that Alistair seemed to be waiting for, a perfect moment to solidify what they both already knew in their hearts. That moment came on a mild afternoon in early April. The sun was warm, the air sweet with the scent of damp earth and new life. The first of the snowdrops and crocuses were pushing their way through the soil in the small walled garden Ilara and Lillian had reclaimed. The climbing rose on the wall was covered in tight green buds. Ilara was there, kneeling on the damp ground, showing Lillian how to gently thin the new seedlings. When she felt his presence behind her, she looked up and smiled. Alistair stood at the gate, watching them, a look of profound love and contentment on his face. "Lillian, my dear," he said, his voice soft, "would you mind running to Mrs. Gable? I believe she has some lemon cakes for you." Lillian, knowing a private moment when she saw one, scrambled to her feet and with a conspiratorial wink at Ilara ran towards the house. Alistair walked down the stone path, his boots silent on the moss. He stopped before Ilara, who had risen to her feet, wiping the soil from her hands onto her apron. He looked around at the small garden, at the neat rose, the sleeping rose bush, the promise of the coming summer. "This is where it all began, isn't it?" he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Right here, in this forgotten place. You brought life back to this garden, Ilara, and in doing so you brought it back to me." He reached out and took her hands in his. They were no longer the soft, pale hands of a lady of leisure, but they were not the calloused hands of a laborer either. They were strong, capable. Hands that had soothed a fevered child and coaxed life from the frozen ground. To him, they were the most beautiful hands in the world. "When I hired you," he began, his grey eyes searching hers, I gave you a list of cold, cruel rules. I asked you to be a machine, to live without feeling because I was a coward. I was so afraid of being hurt again that I chose not to live at all. I asked you to be a custodian for my daughter, but you became her heart. I asked you to live in my house, but you have made it a home. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. I cannot go back to that silence, Ilara. I cannot imagine this house, this life, my life, without you in it. I am selfish enough to want every one of your days, every one of your smiles, every one of your thoughts. I want to build a life with you, a real life, filled with truth and laughter and love. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, his carefully constructed ducal composure gone, replaced by the raw, beautiful vulnerability of a man in love. My arrangement was for you to care for my child. But that is no longer enough. I need you to care for me. I need you to let me care for you. He took a deep breath, the most important question of his life poised on his lips. Ilara Vance, I am asking you to be my wife, to be the Duchess of Blackwood. Not for duty, not for convenience, but because I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. He paused, a flicker of the old fear in his eyes. Stay, he whispered, the word a raw, heartfelt plea. Not just for Lillian's sake. Stay for both our sakes. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. This man, this house, this child, they had become her world. The cold bargain she had made months ago had, through some quiet miracle of patience and love, transformed into the richest of treasures. Yes, she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Oh, Alistair, yes. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. A smile of pure, unadulterated happiness that transformed his harsh features into something more handsome than she could have ever imagined. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around in the middle of the garden she had brought back to life. Her laughter mingled with his, ringing out in the clear spring air, a sound of pure joy in a place that had been silent for far too long. He set her down gently, his hands framing her face, and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss filled with all the promises of the future they would now build together. The declaration had been made, the question answered. Their new life had truly begun. 1 year later, the gardens of Blackwood Manor were in full, riotous bloom. The small, walled kitchen garden that had been Ilara's first project was now a thriving, fragrant haven, but its life had spread, pushing out into the wider grounds. The overgrown rose gardens had been restored to their former glory, their blossoms scenting the summer air. The paths were clear, the lawns were immaculate, and the entire estate seemed to hum with a vibrant, joyful energy. The house, too, was transformed. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating rooms filled with flowers and the sound of Lillian's happy chatter. The West Wing was no longer a monument to a painful past, but a beautiful, comfortable family space, its walls painted in warm, cheerful colors chosen by the new Duchess. Lady Ilara Beaumont, Duchess of Blackwood, stood on the terrace, a cup of morning tea in her hands, watching her family. Alistair was on the lawn with Lillian, teaching her how to fly a kite. His laughter, a sound she now knew as well as her own heartbeat, carried on the gentle breeze. He was no longer the harsh, haunted man she had met in the dark library. He was open, kind, his love for his wife and daughter evident in his every look and gesture. Lillian, now a confident, bright-eyed 7-year-old, shrieked with delight as the kite caught the wind and soared into the brilliant blue sky. She was a child healed, her quiet anxiety replaced by an infectious zest for life. She was surrounded by a love that was honest and unwavering, and she was thriving in its light. Ilara felt a hand slide around her waist and leaned back into her husband's embrace as he came to stand behind her. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a familiar, comforting rumble against her ear. "I was thinking about the day I arrived," she confessed, her gaze sweeping over the idyllic scene before them. How cold and silent it was. I felt like I was stepping into a tomb. "It was a tomb," he said, his arms tightening around her. "And you, my love, were the miracle that brought it back to life." He turned her to face him, his grey eyes, once so empty, now filled with a deep and abiding love. "Are you happy here, Ilara?" She smiled, a radiant, joyful expression that reached her twilight-colored eyes. "I have never been happier," she said, and it was the simplest, most profound truth of her life. She had come to Blackwood seeking refuge and had found a home. She had taken a position to survive and had found a love that redeemed them all. He kissed her then, a long, sweet kiss that spoke of shared futures and quiet contentment. From the lawn, Lillian cheered for them, and they broke apart laughing. The kite soared higher and higher, a speck of brilliant color against the vast open sky, a perfect symbol of their unbound future. The ghosts were gone, the gardens were blooming, and the halls of Blackwood Manor were at long last filled with love. Dear listener, isn't it remarkable how the most desolate places can become the most fertile ground for hope? Ilara walked into a world defined by loss and silence. She wasn't asked to fix a broken man or bring laughter into a sad house. In fact, she was explicitly forbidden from doing so. Her instructions were simple: be quiet, be efficient, and above all, do not disturb the ghosts of the past. But she did something far more powerful than confront the darkness. She found one small, neglected patch of earth, and she began to tend it. She didn't do it for praise or to prove a point. She did it because it was an act of creation, a quiet insistence on life in a place that had surrendered to decay. And that one small act of patient, steady care was enough to let the light back in. It reminded a man lost in his own private prison that life continues, that new things can grow, and that the quietest actions often have the most profound results. So often in our own lives, we are faced with situations that feel hopeless, or people who seem unreachable. Locked away in their own sorrow or bitterness, we may feel powerless to change the grand, overwhelming narrative. But the story of Ilara and Alistair reminds us that we don't have to. We don't need a grand gesture. Sometimes all that's needed is to find our own small patch of garden, a relationship we can nurture, a skill we can cultivate, a quiet act of kindness we can offer without expectation. Tend to what you can. Nurture the small corner of the world that is within your reach. Bring your quiet, steady care to it, and you may be astonished to find that you have not only cultivated a garden, but you have also healed a heart, and perhaps even your own. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, I would be so grateful if you would like, subscribe, and perhaps share it with someone who might need a reminder that even after the longest winter, spring is always waiting to bloom.